During those meetings, how helpless I felt because I couldn't find the words to bring them even a small measure of comfort. I do remember saying to them that even as a son, as a brother, as a husband, as a father, and as a grandfather, I could not begin to imagine what they were going through. Today, just as in April, we all still struggle to find words of comfort, because we know that we cannot bring back those who were taken. We cannot take away the wounds and the injuries of those who survived. But we have the responsibility, and I submit we have the duty, to take whatever action we can to try to prevent a similar incident from ever occurring in the future. And one of the ways to do that is by closing the gun show loophole. As the governor has said, there are several questions that one should ask when deciding whether or not to support this bill. Do you want a felon to have a gun? Do you want someone adjudicated mentally ill and dangerous to have a gun? Do you want somebody who's a domestic abuser, subject to a protective order, to have a gun? If your answer to these questions is no, then you should support this bill. Under current Virginia law, a person in any one of those three categories who's prohibited from possessing or purchasing a firearm can walk into a gun show and purchase a firearm from a non-licensed seller. That very same person would not be able to make that purchase at a gun show from a licensed dealer who would be required to run the necessary background checks. The time to close this loophole is now, and the way we do it is by requiring that at gun shows the necessary background checks be run prior to the sale of any firearm, regardless of whether or not the intended purchase is to be made from an unlicensed seller or a licensed dealer. I close with the words of President Abraham Lincoln, who said, and I quote, "We cannot escape the responsibility of tomorrow by evading it today." By closing this loophole, we are not only accepting the responsibility for tomorrow, we are embracing it in a meaningful and lasting way, in a way that will provide an added measure of public safety for all of our citizens and our law enforcement officers. Mr. Chairman, members of this committee, I respectfully urge you to support this bill. I thank you.
Are there any questions?
Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Chair, licensed dealers who sell guns at gun shows have to go through the background check today. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Do you know, we get all kinds of numbers and all kinds of information from different groups and different people. What percentage of gun show sales or gun show sales are from unlicensed dealers?
I'll turn to our superintendent and also our Lieutenant Colonel Kemmler of the State Police, Senator Deeds, for the particular.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, good morning, members of the committee. Senator Deeds, the number, and to say that it's exact, obviously, with the range that I'm going to give you, but it's our belief that about 22 to 35% of the sales that take place at the gun show are by unlicensed sellers.
Mr. Chair.
Senator Deeds.
Do you or other state law enforcement agencies have people that monitor these gun shows? I mean, I know that ATF usually is at gun shows. I wonder if any state agencies are there.
We do. We have a significant number of people that are there to monitor gun shows. We also have people who are there to help with the license check and the completing of the forms.
So, Mr. Chair, your 22 to 35% then is based on some information you've gathered at these shows?
Yes, sir.
Mr. Chair, the types of guns that are sold by unlicensed dealers at gun shows, are they mostly antique weapons, or do you find, are most modern weapons semi-automatics and revolvers, or not revolvers, but handguns of any kind sold by licensed dealers, or are there some percentage of those that are sold by unlicensed dealers?
I don't know that I know the makeup. I don't know if Colonel Kemmler's got any data on that.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Senator, it depends on the gun show itself. Certain gun shows lend themselves towards antiques, whereas other gun shows, it's just a firearm show, and it may be a cross-section of different firearms.
Mr. Chair, what I'm trying to
Senator Deeds.
what I'm trying to figure out though is unlicensed people that aren't licensed that are selling guns. Are they primarily selling antiques or older weapons, or aren't the modern weapons, the handguns and the semi-automatics, more likely to be sold by licensed dealers?
If it's a brand new manufactured gun, that's probably more inclined to be sold by a licensed dealer, because it would be a new firearm that would be on the market.
Senator Hurd.
You talk about licensed dealers and unlicensed dealers. I was wondering if you could describe for us the process and requirements for getting a firearms dealer license. And I would hope that there's no such thing as an unlicensed dealer. But can you talk about can you describe that process and tell us what the requirements are for getting such a license?
Okay, Senator, in answer to your question, it was probably mistaken as far as unlicensed dealer. It would be somebody that's selling firearms that is not a licensed federal firearms dealer. The way the process is, you're licensed by the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives. Once you become a licensed dealer by BATF, then you have to register with the Firearms Transaction Center for the State Police, and then we process your transactions.
Mr. Chairman.
Senator Hurd.
But in order to practice law in Virginia, for instance, you have to be a licensed attorney. You cannot practice law if you are not a licensed attorney. And I guess to extrapolate, I'm wondering whether or not, if you sell firearms, if you sell a certain number of them, are you dealing without a license, or is this a totally voluntary process?
When it gets into the licensing part, that's under federal law. We don't license dealers in Virginia. All we do with the Firearms Transaction Program under Virginia law is, if you are a licensed federal firearms dealer, you're required to register with the Department of State Police in order for us to do the instant background check.
Thank you.
Just one more follow-up, Mr. Chairman. But what I'm asking is there a requirement in federal law, and maybe you don't know, and perhaps there's someone here who does, but is it a requirement in federal law that a person who sells, for instance, a certain number of firearms in a year's time is required to be licensed? And I'm wondering if that is a legal requirement.
In answer to your question, Senator, I'm not exactly sure how BATF interprets it. I've heard the term engaged in the business, but I don't know what the whatever interpretations may be from ATF dealing with that term.
I think there will be someone later that can answer that. But
that is, I hope that will happen.
All right, Councilor Flaherty.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me, if I may, just very briefly speak to what the bill is not. And this bill doesn't prohibit what I refer to as good old-fashioned horse trading. I don't think there's probably any group of people that do more of that than we in law enforcement, that sell guns among ourselves, sell and trade. And this bill certainly doesn't do that. What this bill does is goes after a situation where people get to prey, persons who otherwise would be prohibited from getting a gun, prey on an unlicensed seller who certainly would not want to sell to someone who is prohibited. And that's what we're trying to get at with this piece of legislation. When there's a gun show here in the Richmond area or in Hampton, the Department of State Police Firearms Transaction Center does 300 to 350 checks of guns that come through licensed dealers. In Northern Virginia, that number is about 600 on a given weekend. But we still get a number of calls from citizens who are there trying to sell weapons, who would like to have this service, who would like to be able to check and make sure that they're not unwittingly selling a weapon to someone who is not entitled. So that's what we're trying to get at here. It's been said, we talk a great deal about the tech tragedy, and Secretary Marshall's already mentioned the fact that he and I went there. There's not a more horrific event that I've encountered in my 33 years with the Department of State Police. Sun Wee Cho didn't get his weapon from a gun show. We're not inferring that he did. But what he demonstrates to us is what happens when a person that should not be entitled to get a gun gets his hands on one. That's the horror that they could bring to a community or to a college or to anywhere in Virginia. I hope it'd be your pleasure to support this bill.
Colonel Friday, I have some Quill.
Colonel, an unlicensed individual at a gun show who wants to sell a weapon to someone and inquires of you if they can get a background check on a potential buyer, is that possible?
No, sir, it's not.
Thank you, sir. Oh, I had one other question. Your law enforcement officials have to make stops and apprehend people. Is there an extra danger to them if people who are insane and people who are convicted felons or under protective orders have guns? Does that pose an extra threat to your law enforcement officials?
Well, certainly, if individuals that should be prohibited for one of those reasons has a weapon, it's certainly a danger to us.
Thank you, sir. Next is Norfolk Sheriff Bob McCabe. Identify yourself, please.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, committee members. I'm Sheriff Bob McCabe, Sheriff from the City of Norfolk. My remarks are going to be very brief. One of the things I did last night, I just wanted to look what the definition of loophole was. The definition of a loophole is a gap in law, a small mistake or omission in a rule or a law that allows it to be circumvented. You may or may not be aware of the Christopher Newport University Center for Public Policy. They just this month did a survey, a scientific survey of the top priorities in Virginia amongst voters. Number one was change the law to stop people with a history of mental illness from purchasing guns. And they broke it down politically. Democrats 82%, Republicans 75%. The second priority was require gun purchasers at gun shows to undergo the same background check required for guns purchases at gun shops. Again, breaking it down among party lines, Democrats 80%, Republicans 66%. I think that shows that it's not a partisan issue. Why would we not want to try and close that loophole that allows the people who have been aforementioned, convicted felons, those who have been adjudicated mentally ill, violent domestic abusers? And my last comment is, I would like to think that we're going to be proactive when it comes to matters of public safety and not reactive. I would much rather be standing here talking about closing this loophole this year than next year saying, you know, if we had done it last year, then such and such wouldn't have happened. Just because we can't identify right now specifically anybody who has been able to get around this loophole, I'm sure it's happening, and I'd hate to see it happen, and then we come back here next year and say we should have done it before. And lastly, I purchased a gun myself. The gun shop didn't know I was a sheriff. It took less than 5 minutes for the instant criminal background check. I was in and out. The Virginia State Police is open 7 days a week, 8 a.m. to 10 p.m. to do instant background checks. To me, this is a public safety issue, and I'm not, to be honest with you, in my 25 years of law enforcement, I'm not even sure why we're even debating this. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
I got a question. I'm not sure it's for Sheriff McCabe or maybe Colonel Flaherty or Major Kimmler. With respect to, and again, we get all kinds of information from people on all sides of every issue. I want to know, you said 22 to 35% of the guns sold at gun shows are unlicensed. Do you have any numbers tracing weapons involved in crime to that statistic? To the guns that flow from unchecked weapons sales at gun shows? No numbers?
I thank you. Chief McCabe, Chief Bob McCabe, Senator Stalin has a question.
Bob, you're a good friend, and I know that you do a good job at Norfolk as the sheriff. And I know this is an important issue.
Can you give me some idea about the last crime that was committed in Norfolk with a gun that was purchased from an unlicensed dealer at a gun show?
I don't have any specifics on that, Senator, and at the Sheriff's Office, we wouldn't track that. If that was an issue, that would be tracked by the Norfolk Police Department.
Mr. Chairman, do you know of any crimes that have been committed in Norfolk by a gun purchased from a gun show?
I don't know of any specifically.
All right, thank you.
Chesterfield Chief Troopers.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Terry Dupuy. I'm the Chief of Police in Chesterfield County. I'd like to take just a few moments to offer my support of closing the loophole. And I don't have the statistics, as Senator Stolle just asked, either. It's something that obviously it's a question that we'd love to be able to answer. The point here is that we're trying to look at this from a standpoint of public safety, not only for the community, but our police officers as well. We encounter situations on a daily basis, and I'd like to just reference one that happened 2 weeks ago when one of our police officers became involved in a struggle with an individual that had a firearm, a gun. Had it not been for the help of 4 people that stopped on the side of the road to help that police officer hold this man down, I'm fearful that I probably would have already been to a funeral. It's a dangerous and scary piece of what we do in law enforcement, and anything that we can do to try to help close some of those loopholes and prevent individuals that do not have a legal right to possess a firearm, that we should be doing this today. We need to talk about it. We need to confront these issues as we are here today. I understand that you're not going to vote until Wednesday, and I hope that gives you an opportunity to listen to other points of view on it. But I'm here on behalf of the Chesterfield County Police Department and members of my community to support closing this loophole. Thank you.
Thank you, Chief. Richmond Police Chief could not accompany Senator Deputy Ray Tarasic.
Thank you, Senator Norris. I am Ray Tarasovic, Assistant Chief of Police for the City of Richmond. This morning I offer our support to Senate Bill 109 to close what is being termed as the gun show loophole. The City of Richmond has experienced over the past several years a significant reduction in violent crime, while nationally the trend in cities has been a slight but troubling increase. Our successes have been hard fought and are the product of unprecedented partnerships among city, state, and federal law enforcement, the unwavering commitment of city government, and most importantly, a community that has risen in partnership just to say no. The most graphic example of our success has been the 32% decline in murders in the past year. The 55 murders we experienced last year was the lowest total in the past 30. Yet, these murders required the notification of 55 families that a loved one had been lost to violence. 80% of these murders were committed with firearms. That percentage has been unwavering. 195 additional persons were assaulted with firearms in the city last year. The story of the impact of these assaults on their lives often remains untold. The Richmond Police Department seized almost 1,200 firearms last year. More than 900 of these were handguns. Almost 300 of them were possessed by individuals 21 years of age or younger. Most alarmingly, the Richmond Police Department has arrested and charged more than 800 people in the past 3 years with possession of a firearm by a convicted felon. These persons had no right to possess or carry a firearm. Their acquisition of a firearm by theft, gift, or purchase was unlawful. There are too many firearms in the possession of those who threaten rather than ensure public safety. Others today have and will speak more eloquently and passionately than I regarding the possession of firearms by those who are mentally ill or previously engaged in domestic violence. These unlawful possessions only swell the number of illegal firearms on our streets. Conducting background checks of all purchasers of guns at firearm shows is, in our belief, a powerful tool that can, without hardship to legitimate purchasers, be utilized to thwart the proliferation of illegally possessed guns on our streets. We do not mean to imply that all or most illegally owned guns are purchased at gun shows. Nor do we believe that the enactment of this legislation is a panacea that will instantly rid our streets of illegally owned firearms. But its enactment will provide us with another tool, a tool that may discourage 1, 10, or 100 illegal purchases, potentially saving 1, 10, or 100 lives. Your support of this bill can place this tool in our arsenal. Thank you.
You represent Chief Monroe?
I do represent Chief Rodney Monroe of the Richmond Police Department.
Tell him thanks, he's doing a good job.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair, could I ask
see.
a couple of questions? How many arrests did you say were made of felons in possession of firearms?
810 over the past 3 years, 290, 270, 240 something.
And how many of those possessions of firearms were traced to purchases made by the felon at an unlicensed or an unregulated sale of gun shows?
I don't have that statistic.
Do you think anybody in the department does?
I don't believe so.
Okay.
Thank you. I see. Started.
Do you guys, I know one time the Virginia Beach Police Department was, when they recovered a weapon as a result of a crime, they were asking questions about where it came from. Do you guys do an investigation or inquiry, any inquiry at all?
Traces are done on firearms through BATF, through the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. But I don't think with this kind of specificity, I think you can probably determine whether a private sale occurred, whether you can determine whether that private sale, in response to Senator Deeds' question, whether you can determine whether that private sale occurred in one's home or at a gun show. And remember, the loophole is only directed at shows, or the loophole closure. I don't know that you could determine where that transaction occurred. You could only probably determine that it was a private sale.
Mr. Chairman, actually my question was, do you guys ask where they get the guns?
Yes, all the time.
And if you ask that question, don't you have any data on guns that come from gun shows? I mean, have you had anybody say that I purchased a gun at a gun show that I used in the
Senator, I just don't have that information. I would be willing to offer it.
Thank you, Chief.
Mr. Chairman, in the course of my practice, I often ask clients that very question, and the answer with little variation is always from somebody down the street.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman.
I have...
Mr. Chairman, I have a question. Mr. Chairman, I have a question.
Mr. Chairman, I don't know if Mr. Chair Sovic can answer this or somebody else, but when the legislation says at a firearm show, and maybe Mr. Benjamin can answer this, does that mean physically in the firearm show? Would that include the parking lot? Is there a certain amount of proximity to the show for it to be at, or is it physically inside a building where a firearm show is being held?
Claudia, looking at that, I recognize in the audience the sheriff of Petersburg and some of her uniformed deputies. Would you raise your hand, Sheriff? And I'm assuming you're here in support of the legislation, and you have some deputies. Thank you for coming. Also, this may be a good time to have a show of hands, because some people can't get in. All those here in support of the legislation, raise your hand. Thank you. And those here in opposition to the legislation, raise your hands.
Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman.
Yes. Mr.
Chairman.
I think I recognize Senator Evans.
I've been told and shown some information that the Clinton Justice Department actually did a study as to what percentage of crimes were committed by a firearm purchase at a gun show. I think the figure was 0.7%, that is less than 1%. Have you heard that, seen that study?
Senator, I'm not familiar with
And it was not whether or not it was purchased from a licensed firearm dealer at a gun show, which would require a background check, or an individual who's a non-licensed seller of personal items. And so as far as I know, that distinction wasn't made, but I just want to know if you had heard of that study.
Thank you, Chief.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes.
before you call on the next speaker, I was wondering if I could ask Colonel Kemmler a question.
Colonel Kimler?
Colonel Kemmler, do you know how many gun shows are held in Virginia a year and where they are and how? I mean, I think there's one in Hillsville and one in Roanoke. I don't know if there are more than one at that site during the year, but I was wondering if you could describe for us kind of the number of gun shows that you're aware of in Virginia.
Senator, I can't give you the exact number. I could give you probably some. Richmond has 2 locations. Hampton has one.
A year?
Or no, I'll have to furnish you with the total number. I don't know the exact number. I'm just trying to give you specific locations where I know they actually have them. Salem Civic, I think, has one. Roanoke Civic has one. There's some in Dale City. There's some in Chantilly. There's some in the Tidewater area. But I'll have, if you would like,
I would like to have that information. And I was also wondering, though, some of these locations that you've described, are they annual shows, or are they? I mean, are they every weekend?
They have multiple shows at each of those locations. I can give you from the firearms transaction. I can give you the location of the show, the dates of the show, and probably the number of transactions at each of those shows.
Thank you, sir. We have the chair of the Virginia Tech panel, Colonel Messengill, the next speaker, and we're going to allow time for the Virginia Tech parents to speak. So, Colonel Messengill.
Mr. Chairman, distinguished members of the committee, throughout my career in state government, it's always been an honor and a privilege to appear before any committee of the General Assembly. I stand here today as a private citizen, and I still feel honored and privileged. I thank you for the opportunity. I stand here this morning as someone that for 40 years almost has worked in public safety. 37 of those years with the state police, I guess you could say in the trenches. I was truly honored to end my career as your state police superintendent. I stand before you this morning highly honored by being asked by the governor, and I know concurrence from the legislature, the leadership of the legislature, to head the Virginia Tech Independent Review. It was indeed a high honor. I stand before you this morning a strong, strong believer in our Second Amendment. I don't want anyone messing with my firearms either. But I stand before you this morning saying to you, it's time for us to start doing background checks on all sales at gun shows. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I didn't arrive at this conclusion without doing a lot of soul searching. Because quite frankly, I've been exposed to gun control measures throughout my career, and have always been very apprehensive and very suspicious, I guess, as to the effectiveness of gun control measures. Because I think as a lot of us understand that people that wreak havoc quite often pay no attention to our laws to begin with. But I must say to you that the 2 laws that we have in Virginia, the instant background check and the 1 day a month, 1 gun a month law, has served public safety well. And I, like I suspect most of you, do not want our law-abiding citizens to have to jump through any more hoops than is absolutely necessary to buy a gun. But I think if you look at what we're faced with today, I think you all will agree with me, I hope, that guns don't kill people, people do. So we need to look at the people that are buying guns. Senator Stolley talks about the crime. Senator Deeds appropriately asked about the number of guns that were used in those crimes from gun shows. All of those issues, I don't think will take us anywhere. What we do understand is that people buying guns should be law-abiding, mentally sound people. We have today the capability, in this day of modern technology, to do instant background checks. We're already doing it. The Virginia Tech Review Panel looked at a lot of issues and came forward with a report of which I'm very proud. We spent a lot of time with families, 4 public meetings across Virginia. This was a very emotional issue. And there is indeed 2 sides to this issue. But the Virginia Tech Review Panel was unanimous in this recommendation that we do these background checks. I think if you look at what we're faced with, background checks at gun shows is a very reasonable and a very non-intrusive check that gives us the check and balance that we need. I will close by saying this to you. A little over 40 years ago, when I started as a state trooper in this state, patrolling the highways, the presence of guns were rare. And you could normally anticipate where you would find them, either executing a search warrant or a raid or what have you. That's not true today. Our young police officers today are exposed to guns everywhere. I would ask you the question, if we're not going to keep the guns out of the hands of felons and the mentally defective at point of sale, where are we going to start? What are we going to do? Nothing? I think those of us that are passionate about the Second Amendment need to wake up and realize that reasonable checks and balances come from reasonable people. And I think most people that support the Second Amendment are reasonable people. And I would respectfully ask each of you, respectfully, we know, we can bet, there's another Cho out there. Now this Cho that's judged mentally ill will go into the data bank. So where is that Cho? Or is that mentally adjudicated person going to get the weapon? Or where is he likely to get it? I don't know. I can take an educated guess. But I can tell you what I do know. I know where you can go buy it pretty easily without any questions being asked. So ladies and gentlemen, I respectfully ask that you close this loophole. Thank you.
Thank you. How many do we have to speak? Trying to figure out how we can run 2, 3. We'll hear from you. Be brief so that others can.
I'll try. Marsh, thank you very much.
Identify yourself first. Your name first.
Yes, my name is Joe Samaha. I'm the father of Rima Samaha. Our daughter Rima was killed at Virginia Tech in Norris Hall, room 211. It is an argument. I appreciate the orange stickers that say "Gun saves lives," and we also know the other side of the argument: guns also kill people. And I also appreciate your constituents from coming out from Charlottesville, from Blacksburg, from Fairfax, and other parts of the state to be witness to this today. I will try to speak as quickly as possible, but I do want my words to be understood, so bear with me. The tragedy at Virginia Tech was preventable, a failure of people, law, and institutions. The Virginia Tech panel report is a guidebook that tells us of years preceding April 16, the actions of April 16, and prescribes changes so that April 16 won't happen again. Our legislators, it is your duty to read that book, that panel report. If you've not read it and understand it, then you will not vote for SB 109. Or if you have chosen to ignore its findings, then you do us an injustice and your constituents a disservice. Leadership is about anticipation, foresight, and being proactive. An obvious loophole in the law was exposed on April 16. Who said lawmakers don't make mistakes? You did. You, our lawmakers, did not foresee Cho's ability to get his guns the way he did. The governor had to invoke executive order to close that loophole. With what the VT panel report further exposed, you can no longer say you have not been forewarned. You can no longer say that you are not aware of another Cho having easy access to guns. By voting yes for SB 109, you are voting for public safety. By voting no, you are doomed to relive history. SB 109's sole purpose is to take away what we have learned from our tragedy, the Virginia Tech tragedy, and translate that into a measure of public safety that will benefit all Virginians, including gun owners. SB 109 is about anticipation, foresight, and leadership, among the things that were not in place prior to and including April 16. I will anticipate the arguments of opponents of SB 109, but note, the objectionists do not offer one counter idea or proposal to help prevent the sale of weapons at gun shows to a felon or someone adjudged mentally ill. The opponents know the problem at gun shows exists. Percentages mean nothing. It takes one. But fear, intimidation, and paranoia about further government control will be used to rally you and their membership against it. Instead of being part of the solution, they will ostracize our legislators even if they know enforcing an existing law is the right thing to do. They will claim that SB 109 will interfere with their legal rights to own a gun. They know this is not true. They will argue statistics, but they know it only takes one Cho to wreak havoc on our lives. The facts about SB 109. The bill does not take its intent outside the defined leased premises of a gun show. The bill does not inconvenience the law-abiding gun enthusiast. This bill does not obstruct anyone's civil rights or Second Amendment rights. In fact, it reinforces our civil rights. Points of discussion. Can we discuss that the bill include a family neighbor exemption? Can we discuss that the bill can exclude a concealed weapon permit holder from the requirement? Can we discuss the bill can include a definition of antique weapons that can be exempt? We ask Senators Cuccinelli, Edwards, and Deeds to join us. We ask the NRA, Mr. Van Cleve, and gun show operators to join us. We ask all of you to join the families of Virginia Tech and 7 million Virginians that support SB 109. Join us to promote increased public safety. We ask you to be part of the solution. Join us in making SB 109 workable and keep guns out of the hands of felons and others that should not have them. Do not kill SB 109. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. We have just a few more minutes and a lot of questions, so please keep it brief.
My name is Lori Haas. My family lives here in Richmond. My daughter Emily was in French class the morning of 4/16. She survived the 2 bullet wounds to her head, unlike so many others that day. I won't describe for you in detail what went on because it's much too painful, but it is a mere fraction of the pain suffered by those whose loved ones were murdered that day. They were murdered by a sick person who should not have had a gun by whatever means. I could go on for hours, but in the interest of time, I will not. The heartache for these families will never, ever end. And I stand here today to beg you to consider supporting this bill so that there will not be another family that has to go through that heartache. As lawmakers, it is your job to protect the public. You regulate many, many dangerous items. You regulate prescription drugs. You regulate alcohol, automobiles. We regulate dogs. Can we not regulate gun ownership to the extent that it still protects private sales and yet precludes those deemed ineligible to buy a gun by whatever court of law to keep those weapons out of their hands. This is one small method that we can take in that direction that could possibly save lives, and it would be worth it to save even one life. This has been a nightmare at best for these families, and I pray I don't come close to this nightmare ever, ever again. I pray for the injured students and that they heal and that the families heal. And I pray that you will do your job and protect the citizens of Virginia. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good morning. I am Suzanne Grimes. I'm a BT parent of survivor Kevin Stern. I have traveled here from southwestern Pennsylvania because I'm concerned about the gun laws in Virginia. My only child, Kevin, survived the worst shooting in America's history. To say we are grateful is an understatement. I am concerned that in the state of Virginia at gun shows, not all are required to run a background check on individuals that purchase firearms. Governor Kane supports legislation to correct the gun show loophole. It is evident that the parties stand divided. Governor Kane stated at the convocation at Virginia Tech that a state is a dotted line and has political boundaries, but the Commonwealth has meaning, and that meaning is community. Furthermore, that Virginia Tech will demonstrate that meaning. Consequently, the vote shot down and killed the gun show loophole on Friday did illustrate that Virginia is a state, not a commonwealth. As the world watched the horrific events of April 16th, they watch today on how you can demonstrate a sense of community that you have vowed to serve and protect. This is my only child. Who is a victim of gun violence that had the will to save his life. He faced death, witnessed a horrific assault, and will carry the scars forever, physically and emotionally. He is not the only survivor. There are others that are facing permanent disabilities, and we all carry the emotional scars of April 16th. I am asking you as a mother of an only child, as a concerned citizen of this great country, that you do the right thing and make laws to prevent this from ever happening again. May God speed.
Thank you. With all the Virginia Tech parents who raise their hands, we're not going to be able to hear people one more. All those Virginia Tech parents, would you raise your hands? Thank you. You'll be the last speaker.
Senators, thank you for the opportunity to address you today. My wife's Kathy's given copies of the statement to the clerk, and I hope you'll take the time to read them. I'm the father of Virginia Tech shooting victim Mary Reed. I'm from Annandale, and I want you to take the time today to help prevent or mitigate future tragedies in this Commonwealth, because they are preventable and they can be mitigated. The recommendations of the review panel that Colonel Massengill talked about are important. So is the mental health legislation and the money to implement it. I strongly support it, and I support the chair's bill, SB 177, on the mental health legislation. But that's the easier part of the job. This part is more difficult. It requires profiles and courage from every single one of you, and I will not back off on that. Close the gun-ho loophole, support SB 109. Allow our college university presidents to retain the discretion to determine whether firearms are allowed on their campuses. I'm a proud 20-year veteran of the United States Air Force. I've carried arms in defense of this country. I do not have an anti-gun agenda. I have a pro-life agenda in the simplest sense of the word. And so I urge you, on behalf of Mary and her fellow Hokies, both fallen and surviving, to support this bill. God bless you. Thank you.
Well, would the other speakers identify the parents, identify themselves, so we can identify your name?
Omar Salaha.
And others, the gentleman behind you? Thank you. I think that's all the time we have for the proponents now.
Senator Marsh, could I take a moment and just turn in something to the committee that you may want to take a look at with reference to the Second Amendment For that matter, I can say I'm a parent of a Virginia Tech student who was there on April 16th and am concerned. I have all the respect for the parents. I have respect for the parents and the people who are law-abiding citizens who carry guns, but I am very concerned that people abide by a law that requires them to go through the background check. I didn't have any concern about the people coming into the building today with their weapons because they went through the background check. I think it's important to emphasize that the Second Amendment right is subject to restrictions.
Well, I think that would be appropriate for the button if we can get to it, so you just hold on to that.
Justice Powell is my source on that, and he's a good guy.
Give it to the clerk and we'll make sure it's circulated. Before we hear from the opponents, I'd like to thank the Virginia Tech families for the courage coming.